can understand it is late in the evening now, and we have heard five papers. And it was also interesting to note the interest of young scholars on the subject. It is the evidence, of course, is the insightful papers which people contributed all through this conference. At the same time, those who have attended here. I believe that this kind of an intellectual engagement continues, and we are not actually discouraged by the compelling circumstances around us. That in itself is important for any critical understanding, for intellectual engagement, for the emergence of a certain kind of a political consciousness, and even eventually, if it allows, the rise of a liberating theory or a liberating idea. There are, as we heard in the last session, there were 5 papers. Paper by the recent one by Fazal, which touched upon the question about Islamophobia as a systemic violence. He probably wanted to bring out the kind of structural violence which Muslims in particular have been made to go through. And this is also manifested in, a sort of a systemic nature of inequality which exists, the impoverishment which the community, large sections of the community has to experience. In fact, many a times, I self-reflexively try to, inquire whether the question of Islamophobia in India, is it a question about the fear of, many of you would have earlier also conceptualized it, or I tried to reflect on it, of the unfamiliar? Or is it partially because of, not entirely necessarily, partially because of a certain kind of a class hatred which exists. And this class hatred, why I am trying to say this, is because I would like to elaborate on the fact that if you notice across the country, and this was what such a committee many years ago now, when you all must be in your early childhood, documented through the data provided by the government itself, is that how in every field almost, whether in the context of bank finances, whether it was in the context of private sector employment, or was it in the sector of government sector employment, whether in higher education, in the early years of educational entry into educational institutions, there was a huge inequality which prevailed, and which was more or less akin to, and not necessarily equal to, but more or less akin to the situation which the Dalits of India faced. The Searcher Committee also examined the inequalities which existed within the community itself. And this is something also which we should not overlook. And therefore, when we are talking about Islamophobia, look at the concentration of Muslims in this country. Large concentrations of Muslims are in the eastern part of the country, whether it is West Bengal, Bihar, Assam, and also you can include parts of Uttar Pradesh. These are also the most backward regions of the country. And within these countries, within these regions, Muslims live in probably the most, impoverished and underprivileged areas, underserved areas. And in that sense, you can also notice over the years, and particularly after post-globalization, that how there is a, you know, a process of informalization of the labor force, and this has actually affected the Muslims the most as one of the categories. Today, if you call living in any part of the country, in any metropolis, if you happen to need a plumber, an electrician, unskilled worker, etc., more than 50% chance is that the person will turn out to be a Muslim. This is disproportionate to the share in the population. And hence, when Fazal raises this question of systemic violence, this is something which should not evade us. And while we are theorizing and intellectualizing on the import of this idea of Islamophobia, to what extent does it connect with the emergence of this term or this concept in the European sense, to what extent can it be applied to India, etc., we should also be aware about the peculiarity of the Indian Muslim situation. The peculiarity is that A, it faces, as I mentioned earlier, material impoverishment and inequality, and which affects its chances in the labor market, etc. This self-reproduces itself, because the chances of class mobility without any concentrated effort by the state or major forces in the economy, or only during times of major economic upheavals, can this be really transformed. So it actually reproduces. And therefore, whether it is 2006 Achar Committee report, which was based itself on the 2005 data by the NSSO, or if you examine 20 years later today, the situation would have hardly changed. In fact, what we have noticed is that there is an intergenerational decline, which is quite alarming, which is something which we all should take note of. Usually in societies, either the mobility patterns are static, which suggests that there are not much enabling forces which could allow the social groups, classes, communities to move up in terms of status, income, professions, occupations, etc. Or there is a gradual upward mobility. But it is only in the case of Muslims in India. Now the economists also have started accepting that there is a noticeable intergenerational decline, which means generations which were doing earlier a bit better have not been able to improve their chances further, but rather are facing a certain kind of a decline. We have a paper by, there were different papers which touched upon different questions, but of course, what connected all of them was how this whole idea of Islamophobia as such, which is the central theme of the conference as well, that how it manifests itself in different situations. So we had a paper on anti-conversion laws. Interestingly, we should also be aware that it would be a fallacy to connect, if at all, Islamophobia as a category, as a concept can be applied to India, or whatever the phenomena it suggests, to connect it only with Hindutva in India, or the emergence of Hindutva in India. In fact, if you go back into history, many of the questions today which are being raised, including the question about the anti-conversion laws, it is the 1960s enactments. Many of these laws were enacted during the earlier regimes. I will not necessarily call them secular regimes, but non-BJP regimes. And what is And similarly, not only in the anti-conversion laws, as I examine very closely, the laws, this associated with scheduled caste status, and as you know that Muslim and Christian groups are denied, irrespective of whether they convert out of formerly untouchable castes into Islam or Christianity, but they are denied that status. The moment they accept new religion, they are denied that status. Now, it is based on certain kind of arguments, but all those arguments do not stand, because if castelessness or theoretical castelessness or of Islam or Christianity is to be argued, but then how do you extend it to Buddhists and Sikhs? Both are considered to be, in fact, they were rebellions against the Brahminical order and considered to be, again, theologically casteless. And this again continues from the 1950s onwards. And when we examine it closely, what we notice is that while the laws, including the Apex Code, was disallowing the SC status, denying the SC status to those who converted out of Hinduism or Buddhism, or there were very rare cases, of course, but out of Hinduism into Islam and Christianity, citing all these reasons, castelessness, etc., etc. But at the same time, they were approving the return of those who had converted into Islam and Christianity back into the Hindu fold and conferring them the SC status. In some sense, you can say that this is the legal Gharwapsi campaign which has continued in India for. So the reason why I say that Hindutva and Islamophobia may not necessarily have a direct connect, in the sense that the emergence of Hindutva as a organized political program, as well as backed by a political organization called RSS, Hindu Mahasabha, or its political front, the Jan Sangh or the BJP. It does not coincide with the enactment of very many of those ideas and laws, etc., which we today might refer to as having certain kind of a majoritarian bias. So therefore, I would argue that there has been a past, a history, which we may not necessarily have to really get lost into it and ad nauseum repeat it, just unnecessary to embarrass those who need not be embarrassed today in today's political context. But to understand what its importance, to understand what its origins are, to really be able to combat it effectively, going back into history might be required, but with a caveat that don't get lost into it. Don't use it as a political weapon essentially to equate what Hindutva is doing today and what others could have done it in the past. This is important, otherwise there cannot be any kind of a solidarity which can emerge, essential to fight majoritarian assertions. And this is you can draw from parallels from different parts of the history. What we are facing today is not what what other parts of the world have not faced earlier. They might have faced it in the worst form. So that is one point which I'm trying to just suggest. And this is the paper which also which was by, I think, Shyamali Singh online. She presented and tried to bring out the nuances of the. Interestingly, these laws are called freedom of religion laws, but actually they bar freedom of religion. That your freedom to accept a partner out of your own religion from any other religion is severely curtailed because of these freedom of religion laws. Another interesting aspect of these freedom of religion laws are that they facilitate intermarriage between quote unquote Abrahamic religions. Non-Abrahamic religions. But try to create all kinds of impediments. Not marriage, conversion. So, but create all kinds of impediments when it comes to a conversion from non-Abrahamic to Abrahamic religion. You need to take permission from the district magistrate, which will never come. In the process, various different kinds of nefarious groups are alarmed, and therefore all kinds of mobilizations take place. There were other important papers, including one by Alaika, sitting here, also our friend, Ramesh, yeah? And both of them again highlighted this question of the importance, the way in which we can understand the implication of Islamophobia and how can we draw it from various different kinds of things which we have witnessed and which have manifested in our recent past. Pandemic, of course, was one context which was highlighted by Alaika. And if you recall, that not only the prejudices against Muslims, but pandemic became a context in which prejudices against almost all kinds of prejudices were allowed to have a field day. The carriers of the virus, this time at least, were those who were more affluent because it traveled from abroad to India. But those who were suspected of carrying the virus were your usual maids, the drivers, and others who were barred from entering into the lifts, into the gates of the housing societies. And again, while Tablighi Jamaat, etc., and their followers were singled out by the state itself, who started producing data separately from amongst those who were infected by virus and belong to the Tablighi Jamaat congregation. Now, what is it that it suggests? Butler has an interesting concept of this precarity. Many of you would be familiar with it. And what she argues is that precarity is what we many times say, that everyone is equally affected. It is a sort of a crisis which every section of the humanity has to face, like environmental disasters, wars, floods, etc. But what is more important to examine is the dynamics of power which operates in the courts in precarious situations, where those who are powerful or in some senses privileged might be able to experience the crisis in a completely different way, whereas for others it might be compounded. And this exactly what could see during period of the pandemic and the way in which the society responded to it. But why should we alone look at the society which is largely disorganized, but the organized institution, the state too, functioned in that way. So I do not have a fundamental problem with the idea of Islamophobia, but I have my reservations in its all-encompassing usage in the Indian context. because of the word phobia and also because of the word Islam associated with it. Phobia is fear, anxiety. Literally, it could be unfounded fear altogether, which has no rational basis, and yet, as Salman Saeed would call it, as fundamental fear, yet it's something which continues to haunt you. Now, why would Islam, as such, be a source of that fear? When Islam has existed in this country, in this region, I would say, before it emerged as a country, for more than now 1500 years or so, when it has coexisted and faced different kinds of situations along with others, all kinds of precarious situations as well. Followers of Islam again are found in every part and region of the country. And as a sociologist, I generally argue that there is a term called Muslim society is a misconception altogether. You cannot think of a Muslim society altogether, because a society has to be, something which is a complete whole, But interdependence is what is something fundamental to the situation, the social structure which has emerged. In a UP town, who would depend? The weaver is one who would supply the clothes, the textiles, early at least. There was a Qurayshi meat seller who would supply your need for the meat. And there might not be other kinds of options available. And similarly for Muslims, they will have to depend on occupations which are largely taken by other kinds of religious groups. To think of a completely isolated society based on simply on religion itself will be very difficult to see or observe in real situation. You can conceptually create it. You might add certain kind of features to it as well. But when you go for a field view of that kind of an idea, you will notice that large sections are actually interdependent. They are not isolated entities. They are interdependent entities. And hence, to think of a society altogether in isolation will be a completely, to live in a sort of a paradise which does not really, sort of reflect the reality. And in that situation, then, why should there be a fear? The other reason why I have a certain kind of a reservation with the term Islamophobia is that it takes away, it assumes that there is a certain kind of a prevalence across societies and cultures, that there is a spontaneity associated with it that is prevalent across, and there is no deliberateness in its production. I am trying to hint at the politics which brings about these kinds of constrained relationships between communities, and which actually survives on it and sort of, you can say, prospers on it. So when we are talking about Islamophobia, we need to examine that what is that politics, and what is that history to it politics, but at the same time, what form has it adopted today? And as apart from being intellectuals, but politically engaged intellectuals, we also need to think about certain kind of counter-hegemonic exercises. How do we then combat when we have already diagnosed that it is something which is in and around us, that it is now being consciously, deliberately produced by forces which are beyond our control at present as such, but extremely powerful forces. If you look at the legal apparatus, it constantly reproduces such discourse. I don't see Fazal here, but otherwise he would have enlightened us on this. And then when someone calls it as constitutional Hindutva, I am really perplexed. How is this Hindutva constitutional? Constitution and legality are two different things. You can legalize a completely unconstitutional act as well through various means. Tell me, Article 370, how many of you have read it? Article 370 is one of the most constitutionally protected sort of an article, whose erosion required a concentrated effort. It demanded that the will of the people, of the place, Jammu and Kashmir, had to be taken into account. Only when the people decided that it had to be abrogated, that processes could be started. The will of the people, you can say that the state assembly, because they are representatives of the people sitting there, they represent the will of the people. But can a governor appointed by the president, representing the state, representing the central government, unelected, answerable only to the central government and not to the people, represent the will of the people? What is constitutional in this act? What is constitutional in criminalizing a civil act such as divorce? Today, for good or bad, but the fact is that a provision which otherwise for everyone else is a civil law, but when it comes to Muslims, it is a criminal. It comes into the criminal domain, and which will allow to all kinds of excesses. Then leaves it open. So, I submit to argue that rather than without taking away the importance of the concept Islamophobia, please don't misunderstand me, but I will try to draw your attention towards a process called otherization. And I would rather myself prefer something like otherization, because it is a process which looks into how in different times communities, including Muslims, have been otherized, what kind of majoritarian anxieties have worked behind that kind of an otherization, what kind of politics and what kind of, say, combination of multiple historical forces have produced such otherizations. In my understanding, otherization is not necessarily static. At different times in India, different communities have been minoritized or otherized. Say, for example, the Sikhs during 1984. It was short-lived, but it was one of the most integrated communities. Sikhs participated in anti-Muslim violence during the sections of Sikhs, during the partition riots. They were so nationalist, quote unquote. But the tide turned against them. 1984, they were the targets. I have myself witnessed when I was traveling the train that my fellow person, a Sikh who was traveling as well, the police came and checked his luggage and not mine. I bore a Muslim name, he bore a Sikh name with a turban. But that was 1980s. Today, that's not the case. more than enough. So, so therefore, otherization is something which we need to examine closely. We need to see how this has affected different communities in different ways, and what political ends has it, served. This idea of otherization also suggests certain kind of deliberateness behind it, certain kind of politics behind it, certain kind of coming together of forces with an intent to do it. It is not simply our culture, our other things rooted into it, but more than that, it suggests that even though all communities, including Muslims, have certain prejudices about the others, they have certain kinds of ideas about the others. Those are cultural boundaries which communities erect. But that doesn't necessarily lead to hatred, violence, because all these need certain operative tools. Who provides it? That is the need for investigation. When do they do it? In what context? That is something we need to be very serious about. And how do we really counter and combat it? So I have certain, very quickly, I have jotted down certain things which need to do probably. To engage with this situation, how to maybe combat it. One is very often what we do is that we take refuge in, when under certain kind of a siege, we take refuge in what I would call as identitarianism. And this results in defending even what is indefensible within. That it also results in certain kind of closing of all kinds of engagements with others, at looking at suspicion with every other sort of a community or politics. And we start looking then for all kinds of proofs, evidence, as well as searching for certain purity of forms. As an example, I can say that as I began my this talk by suggesting that Hindutva has its origins in the politics of the past, even before the emergence of organized Hindutva. But this does not necessarily mean that we use this history of secular politics in India to today argue that you are not worth engaging with, that we are suspicious of your intent even when you are rallying against, for whatever reason, against Hindutva, that we will not lend our support. We lend our support, but we lend it our support with certain kind of our criticality, without necessarily compromising our criticality. So building solidarity is one very important task which we need to do. But what we need to also be very conscious of is over-intellectualization. That ripping apart every kind of idea or concept which comes as a combative idea against you, without looking at, we can point out its weakness, but we could also see as the situation in which it has emerged, and how it can be, that weakness can be removed, and understood. We can empathetically understand as well, If I give examples, you will tell me that I am suggesting one political alignment or the other, which I am not. But I'm just offering a formula. And we have to be very, very watchful about the intellectual collaborators who can be within us as well. They can come up with an argument that whatever is being offered is, useless, is not something which we should accept. That some similar kind of argument that it also has its own weaknesses. They can also start finding merits in the Hindutva logic many times, and I have seen people doing so. Pages of the Indian Express open up, Times of India open up for them. But at the same time, intellectually combating means intellectually combating, not physically combating. So we need to be actually intellectually alert without completely dissociating. These are just some self-reflexive kind of an idea which I have. There are many other things which all of us would like to be part of, to collectively think, to collectively, be able to deal with the situation which we are in. I have published a book called Majoritarian Times. It had its problem with the publisher Penguin, asking us to remove the title, etc. But we said it aptly captures the situation. But many people were not very happy with it. They said, why didn't you call it as fascist times? Or why do you call it majoritarian times, etc. There can be all kinds of ways in which we can understand it. But the fact of the is that what we are facing today is a certain kind of a majoritarian aggression. But there's also a possibility of overturning it, and that possibility that hope, that kind of a, you can say it is a utopia or whatever, but it is that hope which keeps us going. And everyone who is a politically engaged person is actually a very hopeful person. And I respect all of them, irrespective of even if you are coming from the right. But if you are politically engaged, you are thinking about a future and not simply resigned to the fate. Thank you.